Hello, everyone. My name is Gaurav Seth. I am a program manager on Azure App Services team. Now, here is a quick view on the demo scenario that I'll be talking about. So, I work with a lot of customers who discuss about modernizing and migrating their on-premises .NET and Java, all sorts of web applications over to Azure App Service. And with the advent of generative AI capabilities, the other use case as well is how to uh, take and how to harness the power of OpenAI for Azure OpenAI for their existing .NET web application. So what I'm going to showcase today is how do you modernize your web applications which are running on-prem. How do we go ahead and use the Azure Migrate tooling and GitHub Copilot chat so that you can easily do a source code analysis for a higher degree of successful migration and execution of your web applications once they are migrated? Then, how do I actually migrate my web applications with code and configuration over to app service? And finally, how do I infuse generative AI capabilities using one of the options available to me for an existing ASP.NET Framework application? And before I jump into the actual demo, here is a quick topology of the demo application that we are talking about. So we would use the Visual Studio Application Code Assessment Toolkit to analyze an existing ASP.NET web app on-prem. We would make the required code changes to ensure higher degree of success when we migrate this web app to app service. Then we migrate the web app using any of the tools I mentioned. Now, the important point here to understand is you may decide to introduce generative AI capabilities before or after the migration, depending on your use case. Now, for my demo, I am going to use Azure OpenAI Client SDK for .NET, and this would be using GPT 3.5 Turbo as the model behind the scene. Now, the other important point I want to highlight is that for the deployment in Azure, we have all required resources which are there in a landing zone, which follows best practices for app and related services deployment, especially around scaling, isolation, security. And again, as I've highlighted, all communications between app and other required Azure services is secured using virtual networking and managed identity based authentication. With that, let me switch over to Visual Studio. Now, here is the demo application that I was talking about. Here is the source code. This is a classic form-based ASP.NET Web application. Now, the first step in my journey is to go ahead and actually download Visual Studio Application Code Assessment Toolkit from Marketplace. Remember, this is free of cost. You download this extension, install it, and after that, you will get to see this new menu option available to you, which is called Re-Platform to Azure. Once I click that, I get two options. Either I can run a new assessment, or if I've already done that, I can open an existing one. I'll go ahead and select new. And then it lets me choose that what's my intended services Linux. Now, in my use case, I'm going to use Azure App Service Windows. I selected, I click on next. Now, I remember my both. For the demo purpose, I just select the first one. I click on next. Now, in addition to source code and settings, I can also decide to include binary dependencies, which would even be external to my project for source code analysis. And I click analyze. Now you can see that within a matter of seconds, I actually get a compatibility report. It's a nice dashboard. Let me get into the aggregate issues, which gives me like a deep dive options for every issue that's getting reported. Now, one important point to understand here is that in terms of severity, we come back and report three different levels of severity to say so. So it's like mandatory, something that you should fix before service, and then it's potential and optional. Potential is something that you should fix before you go ahead and handle the scenario. That Azure App Service, and optional basically it's something like good to have, something that you should make a code change about, but even then you should be fine mostly. So let me start by showing you a mandatory. So the what it's telling me here is that my web application using Windows authentication, which is not supported on Azure App Service. So what we need to understand here is that Azure App Service supports authentication, but it's not the integrated authentication that most of our web application on premises use. So most of our web application would again not be able to authenticate using authentication. So what I can do here is I can click on Ask Copilot. Now, if you have the GitHub Copilot chat extension involved, once you click that, look at the power of what I keep calling as AI modernization and migration. Now, this is exactly once it understands what the issue is against which it needs to give you it is telling you that you basically go ahead and implement Azure Entra based authentication. You could also update your application code, and then there are a bunch of additional resources if you wish to refer, especially around what are different app services authentication mechanism available for you. So that's mandatory. Now let's look at the next option, something like that's been reported as optional. So in this case, if you see, my web application is using a database connection string. Now, I should say majority of the applications that I've ever worked with or I continue to work with, there would be some sort of a database connectivity. Now, there are multiple options to again go ahead and handle this scenario. It could be that along with your web application, you might have already migrated your, let's say, the SQL Server database on-prem to Azure SQL, or you might be doing it post a web application migration, or there could also be a scenario where your web application on-prem. Again, the point that I'm trying to highlight is that once you have a database, you need to make sure that your web application is able to successfully connect to a database. Now, again, I can go ahead and ask Copilot about it. And if you see here, I'm again being presented with multiple options how I can go ahead and handle the scenario. So it's asking me to use the configuration builder's NuGet package. That's how I can do it. I can even store my connection string in a key vault, and then I can use key vault references in my code. So again, that's an additional layer of security. So the idea here is that basically this extension allows you to use the power of GitHub Copilot chat extension to help you modernize and analyze and modernize your code base so that you can go ahead and migrate that over to Azure App Service. Now, once you're done with this step, you've made the required code changes, checked in your code. There are multiple ways that you can migrate your web application over to Azure App Service. It could be if you're looking at like a multitude of web applications across different web servers. On-prem, you could use our whole Azure Migrate integrated experience, which lets you discover, assess, and do a bulk migration of web applications. I could even say pretty much across your data center. Or if you're looking to migrate web applications over from a single IS server, you can do that with a PowerShell scripts. Or if you're just trying to experiment, you can also use Azure App Service Migration Assistant. So once you use any of these that's what you start seeing. Now what I've done, I've gone ahead and migrated this web application already, and here is my web application that I have migrated. Now if you remember, in the demo scenario, spoke about AI assisted modernization, migration, and then finally how do I introduce generative AI capabilities for an existing framework app. And again, I would want to highlight the point here, in existing framework app. So the idea is that you don't need to rewrite your web application from scratch. If you have an existing framework application, there are options available for you to introduce generative AI capabilities. But I also want to highlight at the same time that this is just one scenario or one use case. You could also go ahead and like do a net new development using stuff around .NET 8, or maybe what's going to come in .NET 9. So as a platform, we support all of these latest and greatest frameworks, not only .NET but other languages as well. And in addition to that, you could also look at more complex AI integration scenarios, let's say semantic kernel, LangChain. So yes, all such options are available for you to use. Now, what I do here is let me get into any of these products. I get into this product, and what I did, this was an existing web application. Post migration, I've introduced this new capability, chat with AI assistant. Let me go ahead and ask a question. Suggest a travel bag under $100 for students. So now what happens is what I've done, I have gone ahead and sent my query over to Azure OpenAI endpoint. And now the endpoint has given me this response. Let's go ahead and see what are the kind of code changes that I made. So I'll again switch back to Visual Studio. And what I've done here is this is the page, as I just showed you, chatbot.as chat controller, and that is where all the code lies. Now in my chat controller, quickly I want to point out that I'm using the Azure and the Azure AI.OpenAI using managed identity. The important point to understand is this is the .NET Client as SDK. I have all the configurational parameters defined over here. And this is the point I want to highlight again, that I am using managed identity credentials for authenticating between my Azure OpenAI endpoint and my web application. Now, this is the method which is of most interest to us. What I do here is I'm using the chat completions API. And before I pass on the message to this API so that I can get a response back, I am also using a prompt template to create a persona for my endpoint, where I'm saying you are an employee of a store that provides product recommendations based on user query. Now you are a bit friendly, and I just want a single recommendation being returned to me. Once I pass this query along with the template, I get the response back, and then I relay it back over to my web application as you just saw. So this is the assisted modernization and migration all the way to integrating as for a net new .NET web application, and you can use all of these options with Azure App Service. Thanks for joining in today.